Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Edinburgh Poltergeist, brought to you by the Poltergeist Project and me, Stephen Miller. Hope you're all doing well. It is the start of summer here in the UK, which means it is absolutely chucking it down and blowing a gale outside. So if you get any background noise, it's probably that, I'm afraid. In the first episode of this series, I introduced this strange story from Edinburgh in 1875. There was water soaking 2 victims, disembodied screams, and all sorts of kinetic phenomena. We've got multiple witnesses over a prolonged period, so on the face of it, it's a pretty promising case. In this episode, I'll reveal, for the first time ever, the names of the 2 principal witnesses and victims of this poltergeist. And I've got first-hand testimony from one of them. I've also been working on who the Wizard of the North was, if you remember. He was blamed for causing this phenomenon by the main victim. But before any of that, I'm afraid I've got a correction to update you on. I did mention in the last episode how tricky it can be to identify exact locations from historic properties. And in the last episode, I got it wrong. Sorry. 153 Rose Street was not the location of the Kenilworth pub. A bit disappointing, really. I'd have liked to go for a pint in 153 Rose Street, but not to be. I wish I hadn't spent quite so long looking into the history of that pub and its associated paranormal stories, but never mind. That's the way it goes sometimes. Sadly, the original building of 153 Rose Street was demolished in the early 20th century to make way for the Rose Street Telephone Exchange. It's in between the Rose Street Barbers and, apologies, Dirty Dick's pub. It's just the nature of this podcast. Researching and releasing these episodes as I go means sometimes these things can happen. If I was to sit down, fully research the story for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then just release it as one episode, obviously this wouldn't happen. But then you'd miss out on all the fun of my mistakes and learning about the process. History is all about constantly checking. History is never finished. You're always constantly going back and learning new things. So there we go. Now, in the course of my research into the history of the building, I came across an 1819 plan of Edinburgh by Robert Kirkwood, which gives excellent numbering and even an illustration of 153. I'll share that on the Poltergeist Project Facebook page. It's a 3-story tenement with some interesting round arch features at ground level, which are definitely not typical of the buildings on Rose Street. There were 9 of these arches, which are still echoed in the existing telephone exchange building, which also features 9 rounded arches. It's clearly an intentional nod to the site's history by the architect, Leonard Stokes. I only mentioned this architectural feature as I wonder if it's related to the suggestion back in episode 1 from one of the witnesses that 153 Rose Street had at one time been used as a military barracks. I found another 19th century reference to this idea. Someone was selling some dogs from 153 and mentioned the old barrack stables behind. Perhaps these rounded archways at one time allowed passage for horses. I know that during the Napoleonic Wars, Queensberry House in Edinburgh, now a Scottish government building, was used as a temporary army barracks. It was even extended to accommodate the 800-men garrison there. Perhaps at the same time 153 Rose Street was used maybe as an overflow or a temporary space whilst they were doing the extension, or somewhere to keep the horses away from the main building. Either way. Anyway, my research into the rest of the history of the building was interesting, but it didn't really throw up anything hugely relevant or even a bit strange, to be honest. An awful lot of people died at 153, but that's not unusual for the period. There were as many people born there as died there, in a time before the National Health Service in the UK and hospitals. Life and death happened at home. It had a very regular turnover of tenants throughout the 19th century. There are constantly adverts for rooms and flats to rent appearing in the newspapers. The fact it was demolished in the early 20th century suggests maybe it wasn't in the best condition. Perhaps even by 1875 it wasn't a particularly nice place to live. It was 100 years old by then. So on to our poltergeist victims. Thankfully, the woman and the child at the centre of this case were already living at 153 on the night of the 1871 census. So for me, they were pretty easy to find, which was great. But piecing their life stories together has been a bit more complicated for me. I always find it an exciting part of the Poltergeist project to reveal these previously unknown parts of a story, and I've cracked quite a few mysteries now. So, for the first time ever, I can reveal that the woman at the centre of the Edinburgh Poltergeist case was called Elizabeth Thompson, and the girl was Georgina McClellan. Elizabeth was born on the 10th of May, 1788. Seems a very long time ago. And before all this, she'd been a shopkeeper. The tricky part has been that Georgina wasn't Elizabeth's granddaughter, as stated in all the reports. She was actually her great-granddaughter. So Elizabeth's eldest daughter Martha had a son called John McClellan. I don't know why, but John was raised by Elizabeth as well, his grandma. On the 1841 census, he's living with her as a 7-month-old already. John himself grew up and had a daughter, Georgina, born on the 28th of December, 1862, 3 weeks before he married her mum. Now, it's not uncommon, children being born outside of marriage, all the time, but they would have had a certain stigma around it. I wonder if that's the reason she was raised by her great-grandma. I suppose also the fact that her dad had been raised by his grandma, so it was quite normal in the family. Georgina did have a younger brother and a younger sister who both stayed with their parents. It seems like a potentially difficult situation, but there's no real insight into it. Now, the diligent reporter from the current newspaper who'd spoken to the neighbours on Rose Street when Elizabeth and Georgina had moved out returned, this time determined to track Elizabeth down. He managed to find a neighbour who was willing to take him to Elizabeth's new address, so long as he kept its whereabouts under his thumb. Elizabeth was still living with Georgina. I found her seated comfortably in an old armchair. She's 86 years of age, yet hale and hearty, and above the average as regards intellect of people of her years. I informed her as to the object of my visit, and she expressed her readiness to give all the information in her power. Elizabeth and Georgina confirmed all the reported activity that was given by the other witnesses in the last episode. Then Elizabeth went on to say, "One day a doctor and another gentleman with him called on me at my house. They asked me all about this business. Well, I said, I don't know what it is, but I think it's something to do with Anderson, the Wizard of the North, and his black arts. But they said he was dead, so I said to them, well, men are getting wiser and wickeder nowadays, and I've no doubt some of them have got his receipts. My opinion is that somebody, a scholar of his, has been throwing something up the stair into the house, and that's been the cause of it. The doctor said that something of the same kind had been frequently done in other houses, and then that did it were flogged for it. I'm sure it's not an evil spirit, for no evil spirit would be allowed to meddle with me. I'm curious about who this doctor and gentleman were. Seems like they were also investigating the story. Fortunately, Elizabeth doesn't give us many clues to go off. If it was later, I would suspect maybe someone from the Society for Psychical Research. Perhaps they'd sent someone, but they only formed in 1882, so if it was someone related, they were operating outside of that structure. It's going to be tricky, but I will see what I can find. Whether there was a famous paranormal investigator around Edinburgh at this period who was looking into these things. I've not come across anything yet, but I will keep looking. And then another unnamed person with the reporter Elizabeth and Georgina said, don't you think that your granddaughter, who may have electrical force about her, may have had something to do with the matter? Elizabeth replied, her? Nothing of the kind. No, no. And then there was the squealing that was so very unpleasant, and used to go on till about 12 o'clock and then it stopped. So, not an evil spirit or electrical force, but the work of a follower of the Wizard of the North. Elizabeth mentioning Anderson, the Wizard of the North, makes it clear who she was talking about. John Henry Anderson was born near Aberdeen in 1814. He was a renowned stage magician. He toured all over the world, boasting he'd performed for all the crowned heads of Europe, including Queen Victoria. He alleged that he was given the stage name the Wizard of the North by the famous Sir Walter Scott, poet and novelist. Now, he was clearly a very good and successful entertainer in his time, though he did go bankrupt more than once. He opened theatres, toured the world, and though he didn't invent it, he popularised the bullet catch trick, though I don't know if he was catching it in his teeth or in his hands. And he is credited with being the first magician ever to pull a rabbit from a hat, which is pretty cool. Harry Houdini, who was born in the same year that Anderson died, was a big fan of his, posthumously. He paid for the upkeep of Anderson's grave in later years when it had been left untended. Now, quite apart from being involved in any black magic or genuine wizardry, Anderson had developed a show highlighting the tricks some alleged spiritualists and mediums were using at the time. He was a paranormal debunker. So why would Elizabeth be so certain that one of his followers was behind this phenomena? Well, in his lifetime, he certainly did arouse suspicion and fear that his shows were more than just trickery and sleight of hand. On one occasion, he was touring a show in Scotland and staying at a lodging house. The woman who ran the house didn't recognise him or his name, but one day he left his umbrella in the stand by the door. The umbrella was engraved, "The Wizard of the North." When he returned, she went wild. "You're the devil himself. I wouldn't lodge you for a night for all the world. I smell brimstone off you, and my blood is running cold. Take your money and this devilish thing," I guess the umbrella, "and get quick, far away from my house." Now it seems like a bit of an overreaction, but perhaps it's indicative of how some people viewed him, and magic generally. An echo of past superstitious beliefs in witchcraft, magic, and their devilish connections. I mean, remember, again, Elizabeth was born in 1788. Only 53 years earlier, you could still face the death penalty for being a witch. And being a witch was an actual thing, legally recognised. There were witches. Elizabeth died a couple of years after all these events, aged 89. A remarkable age for the time, especially given her situation. Not an easy life, having raised 3 generations of her own family. On the 1881 census, Georgina was listed as a servant in a nice big house on Howe Street, just north of Queen Street Gardens. Certainly a much nicer area than Rose Street was. The head of the house was a boot and shoe manufacturer, Auguste Blanc, the son of French immigrants to Scotland. I did search to see if anything unusual had happened at that address during Georgina's time there, but I didn't find anything. And the trail then goes cold. I couldn't find Georgina on the 1891 census anywhere, or a marriage certificate, to give me an idea of a name change. And I do tend to search specific collections, depending what I'm looking for. If I'm looking for someone on the 1871 census, I will just search the 1871 census. Websites like Ancestry and Find My Past have got so many millions of records from all over the world now. It's quite tricky to narrow them down, so it helps. But given I was drawing a blank, I did put Georgina's details into just a general search. And then I found out why I couldn't find her. Sadly, she died in 1890, aged just 27. Now, I've not been able to find any newspaper reports about her death. Like, literally nothing, even just a note saying that she had died, which seems a bit odd. So I've ordered a copy of her death certificate, which will give me some details, at least, hopefully. I know that she died in Edinburgh, or that her death was registered in Edinburgh. 27 is tragically young. It could take a little while for these certificates to be processed, so I'll have to update on that in the next episode. And I'm afraid it's probably going to be a sad story, but I always think it's important to give these ordinary working class people their place in history, for a time at least, in a respectful way. The vast majority of history isn't kings and queens, epic battles, and scientific, cultural, or political changes. It's stories like Elizabeth and Georgina's, just normal lives. In the next episode, I'm also going to share some of the contemporary scepticism around this case. A rival newspaper, the Northern British Daily Mail, had some pretty strong views about the whole case. I'll use a report by them to go through all the phenomena and to consider potential non-paranormal explanations. I'll also have a look into this doctor and gentleman who visited Elizabeth as well, but I really don't hold out much hope given the scant information I've got. Thank you as always for listening. Obviously, like, share, subscribe, comment, all that, etc. Check out the Poltergeist Project Facebook page for updates and some visuals. I'll share that picture of 153. You can also email me directly at the Poltergeist Project Podcast at gmail.com with any thoughts, questions, or anything really, whatever you like. But for now, I will say goodbye and thanks for listening.